Great. So welcome everyone to our conversations on social reproduction. A very warm welcome to all of you. So today's session is special for two reasons. One is that we are marking the 4th anniversary of these virtual seminars on social reproduction. We started in June 2020, a few months after the pandemic. I think we were supposed to have an in-person workshop in April. I think some of you were invited to that workshop at King's, and we moved online. And ever since, we've had these conversations, which have been very generative and have been an immense support to our project on the laws of social reproduction. And I'm particularly delighted today to mark this anniversary by hosting Shirin Rai's book launch. She has a fantastic new book out called Depletion, The Human Costs of Caring, which has been published by Oxford University Press just this year. And it's a much awaited book. We've heard various iterations of it over the years and are really delighted to be able to see it, read it, enjoy it, learn from it, and to discuss it amongst each other. So, of course, Shirin doesn't need any introduction. But for our younger colleagues, Shirin Rai is a distinguished research professor of politics and international relations at SOAS. And she's also a fellow of the British Academy. And she really has a very prolific profile. She's worked on several projects, most recently on politics and performance, on gender and performance, on governance in the international political economy. And this strand of her work on social reproduction is something that has been very inspiring and somewhat different from the existing scholarship on social reproduction, where I think a lot of us have been arguing for the recognition of women's reproductive labor. I think Shirin approaches the issue from a slightly different angle to remind us of the costs of non-recognition of reproductive labor and the costs of performing repeatedly day on this labor of social reproduction. So I will now hand over to Shirin, who will speak for about 20 to 25 minutes. And then we have a wonderful set of readers from different disciplines, which is testament also to Shirin's work. We have Deepta Chopra from IDS Sussex. We have Ruth Fletcher from Queen Mary University School of Law. And we have Swati Shah from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and she's an anthropologist. So each of them will then offer their reflections on Shirin's book, and then we'll have a chance to have a Q&A. So over to you, Shirin.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me all right? Good. So thank you for organizing this book launch, Prabha, even though the book is still to reach the reach the stands because something is happening at OUP, which I have no control over, obviously. I'm really grateful to you and to the project as a whole, really, for not only my talk today, but also for all the work that you have been doing. As you say, it's been very generative for all of us. So let me now sort of say a few words about the book. In New Delhi, 8 women lead different lives, going about their everyday life work. One craves for friendships she has let go because she does not have enough time to invest in them. Another augments her resources through depending on her mother and mother-in-law for household help. And another still feels the relentlessness of her social reproductive labor in the rhythms of her baby's needs. Meera goes walking, climbs over a fence to save 28 minutes extra walking time because the gated community that she works in has shut all the gates but one, which make her journey longer. She does this because she needs to finish her work quickly, to return home, to go collect her children from school, and to do all the household chores before helping her children with their homework and then make dinner. In Coventry, UK, children look after the parents and grandparents who are differently abled or are sick. They find time for themselves in an NGO called Young Carers, where 3 social workers work with them through play. The social workers are overburdened and underpaid. The parents of these children worry about the effects of the care responsibilities of the children on their friendships, school time, bullying, and homework. The Amadiba community in Eastern Cape, South Africa, worries about the mining company that is about to destroy their way of life. The worry takes political form as well as cultural resistance. Violence lurks around the corner. People have been killed resisting. And the worry dissipates energies and affects everyday well being. These are some of the stories of depletion of individuals, households, and communities discussed in the book. Why does depletion matter? Our lives and the lives of future generations are dependent on the work we call social reproduction, the reproduction of life itself, which can be and is being eroded through depletion. The concept, depletion, was inspired by Diane Elson's observation that care work is not endlessly elastic and that depletion leaves the capitalist system, and by the work of green economists who suggested that environmental depletion needs to be debited from the GDP, just as feminist economists were arguing that social reproduction needs to be included in the GDP. Catherine Hoskins, who I'm really happy is here with us in this meeting, Dania Thomas from Glasgow, and I wrote a paper called Depletion, the Costs of Social Reproduction, which was published in the Journal of International Feminists, was published in the International Feminist Journal of Politics 10 years ago. Since then, this concept has found interdisciplinary audiences and has been used to frame the work of geographers, political economists, sociologists, and lawyers, for which, of course, I'm really pleased about, but also grateful. However, as a brief paper, it also had gaps. Issues of race, caste, and class, of environmental depletion were either not or only lightly touched upon. Further, the methodologies of working with the concept that we set out were limited. We put forward a quantitative model to assess and represent depletion. But as I found when I was researching in Delhi, this didn't quite deliver on the promise of really revealing the human costs of caring. New methodologies were needed. So, Depletion, the human costs of caring, builds on this work and other work that I have done since. Having worked with Juanita Elias on conceptualizing the everyday as framed by space, time, and structural violence as well as agency, meant that in the writing of the book, this framing became a central theme. How does the drudgery of everyday social reproduction increase depletion differentially? Further, by bringing into focus issues of race in the context of the everyday, I connect Geronimus's et al.'s work on weathering with depletion. The argument at the heart of this book is as follows. Reproduction of life doesn't just happen. It is labored over in different contexts and with differential resources unequally. In all countries, in all classes, races, religions, and cultures, women perform these labors more than men. But these women are also classed, raced, and located in deeply unequal ways, and therefore experience depletion differentially, intersectionally. Women who cope with this work in the context of poverty and of violence are constantly told that their everyday labor, both paid and unpaid, to maintain the rhythms of life do not count in as production. And yet, we rely on this work every day and know that without this work, we will not survive as a global population, culture, and community. The denial of this work is institutionalized through our methodologies of accounting for work, through our ideological positioning of domestic work, through cultural and sociological gendered norms. The exploitation of this work of life giving and its maintenance depletes and generates crises of care that threaten not just livelihoods but lives. Fundamentally, we continue to take this work for granted as given and costless, even as the costs of social reproduction mount up. So, what does the depletion lens, together with the social reproduction lens, allow us to recognize, assess, measure, and address? First, that the unequal distribution of social reproduction that leads to depletion harms those who care. This harm through depletion is multifaceted to physical and mental health, through discursive violence, as well as to citizenship entitlement, and affects everyone engaged in social reproduction but unequally. Harm can be felt at different levels. individual, household, and community, which are codependent and co-constitutive. Holding harm central to this debate is important because it reveals the multifaceted nature of depletion, the ripple effects of harm, and the urgency to reverse it. Second, the strategies of reversing harm, mitigation, replenishment, and transformation cannot be successful if society as a whole, states, markets, individuals, non-state and collective actors, does not acknowledge this harm in measurable ways. Further, individual strategies for mitigating harm and reversing depletion can only be limited, unequal, and indeed can intensify harm for others. State intervention in addressing the unequal distribution of social reproductive work is therefore essential, if not sufficient, for replenishment as a strategy of reversal of harm. Third, a transformative vision of a good life for all rather than just for some must include human as well as planetary care. Depletion of our environment is entangled with capitalism's pursuit of what Jason Moore has called cheap nature and harms us and future generations. Fourth, the recognition of depletion as harm must recognize the location and histories of inequality that cast long shadows on the current care regime. Race, gender, and class are vectors of this inequality. In the original paper on depletion, my colleagues and I conceptualized depletion as follows, and I have kept to this in the book. Depletion results when the outflows of social reproductive labor, time, energy, lack of sleep and rest, for example, exceeds the inflows of resources, good food, adequate shelter, rest, and sleep, for instance, tipping those affected over the threshold of sustainability. Consent does not mitigate depletion, just as love does not make social reproduction less depleting. Depletion through social reproduction is a concept that also bridges the worlds of paid and unpaid work. Depletion through paid work is affected by unpaid work in the home and vice versa. Measuring depletion is not easy, but it is important in providing evidence to the state and to campaigning for change. Measurement is, after all, a form of recognition. In the book, I build on time use methodology as well as shadowing to show the relentlessness of social reproductive work and its costs through a new method, feminist everyday observation tool, that I developed when I was in Delhi and tried out with the help of my research assistant, Pooja Ghosh, and then refined and systematized with my colleague, Jackie True. And this was trialed successfully in Myanmar and Sri Lanka by Jayanti Lingam and Mel Johnston. Through focusing on depletion, then, we can begin to reveal the full costs of social reproduction, to understand the circuits of power that circulate through the regimes of care and how these might be challenged and reversed. In essence, depletion fundamentally affects the material conditions of reproduction and maintenance of social life, and the struggles for reversing depletion can help us think through the transformation of social reproduction. Reversing depletion, however, is not easy. Depletion is anchored in structural inequalities of gender, race, caste, and class, which are essential to reproduction of capitalist social relations. State policy to address issues of social provisioning and welfare builds on the state's, what Spike Peterson has called the state's unique legal and sanctioning power regarding the production and management of gendered and racialized categories. This, in turn, is generative of unintended and intended differentiated discriminatory practices, policies, and outcomes. The struggles to reverse depletion, as outlined in the book, take different forms through individual attempts to develop networks of friendship or laments against not being able to do so, depending on extended family networks, through strategies of self-care wherever possible, and through challenging and holding the state accountable through political mobilizations. In all these struggles, location matters. Standing in one place rather than another, whether it is along the boundary of class or race, caste or sexuality, or formal and informal work, of waged and unwaged labor, provides vistas and possibilities of social reproduction and depletion that converge as well as diverge. As Ferguson notes, it's not just what we do to reproduce society, but where we do it that counts in an imperial capitalist world. If location is taken seriously, the family form, as well as the understanding of production and social reproduction, and the place of labor and work in capitalism would have to be rethought, as would then the consequent different forms of depletion. If the binary that is generated in the global north between productive and reproductive realms is not always sustainable in the global south, as Alexandra Mazzadri and a lot of us in a network that we are developing on pluralizing social reproduction have argued, then different forms of depletion become relevant to our discussion. Global care chains illustrate this point very well. The care labor needed by the aging population of the global north elicits this labor from around the global south, leading to deficits of care labor in countries supplying this labor. Without decentering the analysis of social reproduction and through it of depletion, a north centric approach can also undermine efforts to build solidarities across laboring classes. I would suggest that depletion as a concept also decenters. Focusing on the costs of social reproduction allows for light to be cast on relationships that invoke love as well as pain, joy as well as exhaustion, solidarity as well as exploitation. Depletion decenters middle class bourgeois notions of care that obfuscate the complexity of the labor of care by revealing the circuits of power in which social reproduction is enmeshed, which depletes individuals, households, and communities with different intensity, leaving significantly diverse routes out of it depending on their socioeconomic locations. The book was largely written during a crisis, the COVID pandemic. But of course, this is not the only crisis that has been impinging on my work and the lives of so many. Other crises, environmental, financial, political, and social conflicts, have all been or have all seen the intensification of depletion as the people struggle to resource social reproduction with racialized and gender division of labor, making life and work difficult. Crises are historically layered. The pandemic struck when regimes of austerity, of racism, and of precarity were already operative, intensifying the crisis of social reproduction and intensifying depletion. All crises have this potential of differentially intensifying depletion of those who have to cope every day with the constrained lives that crises produce. However, here I also want to acknowledge that we are discussing social reproduction and depletion in the shadow of a genocide, where depletion seems an inadequate word to capture the utter collapse of life making in Gaza. So I think conceptualizing depletion actually might lead me to, and in the context of Gaza, might lead me to think about also how do we conceptualize the collapse of social reproduction. Let me now very briefly introduce the chapters that constitute the book, which hopefully illustrate the power of the concept of depletion. Prabha, you let me know 5 minutes before, won't you? So I'll start with chapter 3, in which I analyze the time used in social reproductive and paid labor by 8 women across class boundaries in one day of their lives in New Delhi. We find that tiredness, loneliness, and erosion of self are related to the relentlessness of social reproductive work, which is not always recognized, but often supported by families and communities. Thinking through these 8 lives was salutary for me. The micro practices of care reveal themselves deeply embedded in structures of capitalist work regimes, as well as everyday demands framed by cultural and social norms. The state was largely absent from their reflections about their support networks. Bringing paid and unpaid work together is the arc of everyday travel for social reproduction, commuting. In chapter 4, I think through how commuting subsidizes the urban economy in neoliberal cities. Travel done over space requires not only time, thus stretching the margins of work time, but also affects the body, increased tiredness, the sense of security, reputation, family status as mental depletion, and wages, the money spent on travel could be seen as a subsidy given by employees to the employers. The state investment in physical, but not so much in social infrastructure, also affects this equation. I explored these issues through a close discussion of three stories of an Indian domestic worker, Meera, Sangeeta, a homemaker, and Sabina, a journalist. Class divides them, but their travel to and from paid and unpaid work increases their depletion. Chapter 5, I discuss how depletion moves across generations. Care of children preoccupies much of the work on caring rather than care by children. However, children also care, and their labor is also not recognized. Indeed, it is often seen to be exploitative and therefore something to be stamped out through national and international policy and legal framing. Depletion associated with this work affects children in terms of their education, level of anxiety, friendships, and exclusions, and their households in different ways. Class and race, gender, and economic policies shape the regimes of care as well as the costs of care for these children. Building on an examination of a protest movement against the mining in the South Africa's Eastern Cape, I examined the depletion effects of corporate extractivist mining through the reading of photographs of Tom Pierce, whose work I just love, and you can see his work if you go to tompierce.com, I explore the ideas of depletion and anticipatory harm. I argue that deep connections between gender relations, environmental extractivism, and temporalities of depletion can occur through anticipating the harm to communities and their life worlds and through the burdens of mobilization. I also explored legal strategies and their limitations as strategies of reversing depletion. As you can tell, depletion is not a cheery or optimistic concept. However, as I look back to the life stories of individuals, households, and communities covered in this book, I find much to be hopeful about. This is because despite the challenges of or mal recognition of social reproductive work, despite balancing care work with paid work under conditions of class disprivilege, we find individuals, households, and communities struggling against the structures of everyday exploitation, imagining different lives, and coming together in friendship and solidarity to try and reverse their own and their communities' depletion, present and anticipated. Prefigurative approaches to change are being mobilized to reimagine both care and caring, such that those who care do not suffer continuing depletion of and through this work. However, these prefigurative imaginaries are also embedded in the long histories of gendered, class, and race oppressions and locations, issues not only of recognition, but of and redistribution that are raised in the book. State and non-state actors have a role to play in these reimaginings, but they also do this within the constraints of the historical structures of empire and of capitalism. In the conclusion, I discuss some of these prefigurative reimaginings and translate into local struggles, which open up new avenues of reshaping social reproduction in the everyday. And I also discuss why some of these are more successful than others. In writing this book, I had two objectives. First, mapping and revealing the intensity and extensity of the problem of depletion. And second, to examine and reflect on how it affects our ecologies at individual, household, and community levels, and how struggles to reverse it are taking place in different modes and at different levels. The book then is a plea to recognize the costs of social reproduction and to stop the harm to the ecologies of these life-making practices and flourishings through mobilizations of new imaginaries and activism that are both reflexive and sustainable. Reversing depletion is urgent and demands a solidaristic and transformative approach to world making. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Shirin. You finished with, a few minutes to spare, which is wonderful. So Thanks for that lovely overview of your book. So I will now request Deepta Chopra to offer her comments.
Thank you very much. And I'm really sorry my camera's off. I've got conjunctivitis and I look leukocyte. So I don't think you want to see that. So thank you so much, Prabha, for inviting me to do this, and also for Shirin for writing this book. I'll start with exactly where Shirin ended, which is that, the objectives of the book in terms of looking and examining depletion as a critical, almost a critical juncture that needs to be reversed, definitely has been fulfilled through Shirin's writing, which I think is in the book both absolutely beautiful but also very heartbreaking. Um, so I think for me, what sets this book apart are two things from other sort of like, of course, lots of work on care and social reproduction, and one of them is the insistence almost of social reproduction being depleting, which is a negative, but at the same time being essential, so like a good thing. And it's insistence that depletion be reversed, rather than kind of like, saying that, oh, social reproduction itself or care itself is not is a negative thing. So, like, so we need more of social reproduction, we need more of care to sustain uh, our lives, and the project of life making and flourishing that Shirin so aptly described. The second thing that sets this book apart is conceptualizing this project of social reproduction not just as biological and the reproduction in the home and voluntary work in the community, but also reproduction of culture and ideology. And here, this is where the Zalaban community struggles come in, and I have like some gems of this book are in the interweaving of the effects of depletion in terms of the four things that Shirin talks about in these different chapters. The first thing about time in terms of what depletion really looks like, and also the strategies of survival and thriving in the absence of state support of these 8 women in Delhi. The second chapter empirically talks about the commuting, which is, talks about the time and energy, again, of these 3 women with different class and paid work roles that that really put flesh on the sort of like the why depletion takes place and the how of the depletion. The third chapter weaves in the care by children in the UK, and this is a completely different setting, but one sees the sort of like the golden thread, if I may say, of depletion running through this, finally ending with the planetary care aspect. So, in terms of mapping depletion, Shireen has outlined 3 sites of depletion, which is individual, family, and community, and 3 strategies to reverse it, which is mitigation, replenishment, and transformation. And Shirin talks about mitigation as being the individualized strategies of drawing in family members, drawing in, uh, the different aspects of friendship relations and community relations. In terms of replenishment, Shirin talks about the state being a very primary, a key actor in looking at things like cash transfers and other sort of ways in which the state can take sort of responsibility. And then finally, transformation, which are kind of altering the very structures of where social reproduction takes place. Um, I also really appreciated the ways in which Shirin has conceptualized harm from depletion, which is about, and she categorizes it as different types of harms: the discursive harm, the emotional harm, the bodily harm, and harm to citizenship entitlements. And this is really kind of like, again, putting flesh onto a very sort of like, uh, a very fluid, I should say, concept, which then Shirin really brings her empirical evidence to bear on this. Um, I also I was very taken by the chapter uh, on children's care work, and there is a sense there is the Shirin comes to the conclusion that in this chapter, that while care work is can be by children or by adults, the difference is that for adults the problem is that the care work is not recognized, while for children, the literature and development sector interventions, etc., consider care work as problematic for children. So it is recognized, but it said that, oh, actually it should not be there. Uh, and I was also taken by the last chapter, the last empirical chapter, where Shirin talks about depletion both as experienced as well as anticipated. And I think that those are things that really are important. Um, I had a couple of questions, and these are primarily because of my own sort of uh, disciplinary training, as well as looking at what work I've done on care. And I was wondering about a couple of things. One is about the methodology of the feminist everyday observation tool, and and thinking about how and why this would be different um, from anthropological work on social reproduction and care, um, and also whether the visual analysis that you've done, Shirin, in the Zolobeni community struggles, whether that actually fits into the feminist everyday observation tool, and how that relates to that. My second question was in terms of looking at, again, the Zolawini community struggles, and wondering how gendered were these struggles, in the sense that did you did you find that women were at the forefront of these struggles, or was the discourse that the community, the women were, the discourses that women were talking about, or saying, or relating to, were different from the discourses of the men in the community. So I wanted to ask about that. And my final third question was about the strategies of mitigation, replenishment, and transformation. And I really liked your footnote on kind of looking at how the 5 Rs don't really, like differentiate between sort of like put boundaries between care work and paid work. But I was wondering how these three strategies really map onto the 3 Rs. I mean, I know you've described it in replenishment as sort of like, the like, of course there's recognition, and there's reduction in terms of replenishment, and the uh, and the redistribution. But I was wondering whether the transformation aspect really also mapped onto the 3 Rs, mainly because of Nancy Forber's insistence of both recognition and redistribution as being quite transformational. Um, and yeah, so I think those were my sorts of comments, and I'm again really grateful that I was given an opportunity to read this amazing book. So thank you, Sharon, for writing it for us.
Great. Thank you so much, Deepta. That was really wonderful. So I think we will next move on to Ruth, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Just to join in the thanks for organising this, Prabha, and Sharon, thanks for just bringing so much rich resources together, both in the sense of the collaborative projects that have led to this work, and also just taking the time to present this rich book. I'm just I know I'm going to go back to it over and over again. So similarly, I really appreciated. I think I'll just say a couple of points about the key things I appreciated first, and then maybe some sort of critical reflections or just added maybe points of entry that I will take forward from it. So first of all, I suppose I thought it was just made such a clear case for how social reproduction is a subsidy to global capital, right? And I'm just thinking about our re-engagement with debates around social reproduction and over, so I suppose just thinking a little bit behind the actual contribution in terms of developing depletion, which, I think Deepta has just beautifully brought out the richness of that. But just a bit behind that, I guess, is that we are looking at another, as you say, another post-COVID crisis moment of social reproduction, another moment of engagement with the core, debates about the relationship between reproduction and production. And I just think it makes a beautiful case for how this work is a subsidy for global capital. And that focus on subsidy does give us, concepts that help us get around some of the impasses in the value theory debates. So I just really appreciated that at a theoretical level, the work that the book does in that regard, in how it maps out the value of social reproduction as this subsidy. And then at the methodological level, similarly, I really appreciated the review of the way in which the time use methods and the taking the quantitative approaches seriously. I think so many of us here, myself, just very very much the lawyer in the room, but thinking, dabbling sometimes in qualitative work and being scared of quantitative work, but seeing the value in it. And so I think you made just again a beautiful case for why quantitative methods have to be part of the picture, but also made it accessible and helped us think about ways into quantitative methods that, with time use surveys and with the household satellite methods. And just again, it's a really useful, again, for people who haven't had the pleasure of reading the book yet, it's both the theoretical chapter on depletion and the methodological chapter in making the case for the new methodology. They also do great work in terms of reviewing and presenting a rich body of work for us. So I really appreciate that engagement with the quantitative and the explanation of, and I thought there was a lovely, again, the phrasing around the emotional missingness in time use surveys was just again so lovely, because it was flagging up for us the way in which the texture of time got left out. And then the development of the Feminist Everyday Observatory tool and its combination of, the questionnaire previous to the observation, and the way again in which that's clearly a product of having tried out different time use methods and wanting to relieve the observed from the work of, recording that observation and thinking creatively as researchers about, the politics of our own time as we do research. So, again, so I was, and then the thinking about the interviews afterwards. So I suppose one of the questions for me in thinking about the development of that method is partly about how we could adapt it for observing legal processes as broad, as one moment in the social reproduction process. So I'm thinking about Prabha's work has been so helpful and important in showing us how legal materials record quantification of different kinds of reproductive labour and how we can bring that into the mix. And so then I was trying to think about ways in which observations of court processes, even, could be quite formal processes, about how, so I'm trying to think a little bit about how we might be adapting that, because some of us have been doing work like observing the Court of of protection around incapacity and disability issues. So I'm going to try and think a little bit more about how we could adapt your method for that purpose, perhaps. And then, so I just would encourage people, those two chapters are just wonderful resources in terms of laying out the theoretical and methodological framing, as well as the richness of the substantive chapters. And then again, going back to this question of kind of what's, for me, part of what was underneath underneath the great analysis and case for recognizing depletion. One of the things that came out really strongly, particularly in the chapters following the lives of the 8 women in Delhi, was, again, because you were recording for us the rhythms of everyday life, and that engagement with the everyday was so strong, it made me think anew about the relationship between rhythm and routine. And at times, we often see routine as something that's imposed by clock time. And so production, driving the paid productive sphere, driving how time is organized in the reproductive sphere. But and that does come through a lot of the analysis, right? The way in which clock time then rearranges lived time and relational time. But I thought there was also lots of evidence of how the rhythms of the everyday are doing work of synchronizing and sequencing that's not driven by clock time, that has its own register. And I suppose that's one of my questions, or one of the things I wanted to take from the work and think about it a bit more. Because again, I think it's like part of the challenge for us with social reproduction in drawing out not just the value as quantified as money, right? But the value as the creativity and the labor that is done to juggle and bring all these things together. So the way in which you traced the rhythms, so the getting up early in the morning and the busyness of the morning, that busyness of the morning and why it was busy was the ways in which people were organizing the rhythms of the everyday. So there's a materialization of social rhythm that's working through the bodies there that I want to hold on to as a form of labor that is before it gets quantified, I guess. And then that there's another dimension of it that again, the pace of the rhythms. There was a kind of a thickening and a thinning out of the time of reproductive labor. So I thought Mira's, your description of how the household chores or domestic labor, she hated the domestic labor that she came back to at the end of the day after having done a long day of domestic labor for paid work. And so there was something about, hating the work that you come home to, but it was also because it was at the end of a long day and the cumulative effect of that day and the pace and intensity of the day. So I think for me, there was a texture to the time, the reproductive labor time, and a way in which that thinning and exhaustion helped us think about acceleration and deceleration and pace that is part of ordinary everyday reproductive labor and not, directly technological, right? So there's a kind of a pacing and acceleration deceleration point, I think, here, which comes from the everyday and shows us that that's working in that register rather than purely an effect of technological capitalism or that kind of an argument. And then thirdly, I wanted to, I just again was really struck by, again, the mitigation point and how it was like a register of individual mitigation and the coping strategies and what a richness there was in that. But how it very rarely moved over to the replenishment or to the transformation. And so, of course, I want to end with thinking about how do we what activist work, as you called on us to do, and what scholarly work. How do we kind of think about the value of the coping strategies, because they clearly are like such creativity and such important labor in enabling the reproducer to reproduce herself. But so everything, the kind of claiming of a bit of rest time, the shortcuts, the creative juggling of the chain of tasks. So I wanted to think about the coping strategies and the individual mitigations and ways, the tipping points, I guess, into transformation. And I suppose, because I think there's something about, we never know, right, when the call for, Donatella Alessandrini has made this point in some of her work on value of social reproduction, but we never know when that micro action of calling for more bread, when it will become a revolutionary act, right? We never know that, right? So we have to we're holding on to the individual micro coping strategy, but it can join up with lots of other people's micro coping strategies. We know that, right? It does happen. And I suppose I'm trying to think about how we might draw then on other work around the women's strike, on the green wave, which is often like the green wave. You think of the visualizing of the green flags across Argentina and the claiming, the joining up of all these micro moments. And so I think so I want to think about that a little bit more, about the joining up of the coping strategies across your respondents and for us more generally, and how do we foreground that possibility in response to your great work. Thanks.
Thank you, Ruth. This is such wonderful comments and so thoughtful. So thank you. A call to bread, a call to revolution. Yeah, I like that. Okay, so now I'll hand over to Swati Shah for her comments on Shirin's book.
Thank you so much. Am I audible? Yeah, okay. Thank you, everyone. I've enjoyed hearing everyone speak so much. I will start by thanking Shirin, of course, for this incredible book. And I will also thank Prabha and the Social Reproduction Seminar at KCL for the opportunity to respond. I've learned a lot, both from Shirin and from the incredible work of the seminar, and Prabha, of course. I will start by just a point of gratitude to Shirin for invoking Gaza and the struggles in and about Palestine, because I think that provides a kind of signal gesture for the kind of framing that Shirin is doing in the book. I think this is, if there was ever a moment to frame personal and planetary depletion together, this is it. So thank you, Shirin. I think that was absolutely brilliant and very timely. I know that your book did not anticipate the horror that we are all dealing with respect to the war on Gaza, but it certainly prefigures it. So, I just wanted to start with that, and with just a lot of appreciation for the space and for the framing of this book. I have the great pleasure and privilege of having seen this project be born in Delhi. Shirin and I were fellows at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University, JNU, in Delhi in 2016. And I can't believe how much the world has changed in the last 8 years, and certainly how much JNU has changed in the last 8 years. And if anything, I think the fact that the book does kind of is a prime example of the best of the literature on social reproduction, in that it shows us what happens when people and services and human needs fall through the cracks. And it kind of exists in those cracks, in those elisions, in those ellipses. And those cracks are, of course, getting much wider because the problems of distribution are getting much more intense. So while we are talking about the maldistribution of capital, I imagine we will need many more insightful and creative approaches to how people actually make their lives happen in the absence of proper services, proper taxation regimes, proper infrastructure, proper schools, hospitals, etc. So I just have a kind of a list of points, and I'm going to try to be disciplined and go through all of them in order. What I thought was really a kind of a nice orienting statement comes early on in the book, in which Shirin says that there is the evidence of the debt crisis can be made visible in the politics of care and in who is actually providing care. And I think that is a kind of a signal or an invocation to do this sort of decentering project that I think the book does very well. So rather than talking about individual places in the context of or the filter of things like culturalism or particular historical reference, we really get a sweep of geographies. And we also get a sweep of positionalities that are somehow woven together through the creative use of concepts like intersectionality. So no, everybody is not of the same class position or racialized in the same way, but there is a kind of a shared sense of this idea of private space and all of the things that have to happen within that private space within a liberal or a neoliberalized regime. And I think that's very, very useful at this point in time. I think what a lot of people will really focus on with this book is the chapter on children. We are used to reading a lot of critiques of social reproduction with respect to binary gender and women's work. And some of us who have also been doing queer studies for a long time, as well as anthropology, have been tearing our hair out about the reification of binary gender and heteronormativity in social reproduction literature. And I think thinking about children actually gives us a way out of it in a really creative way, because like queer and trans adults or people who are not making themselves legible within normative family structures, children also could be read that way. You know, they're not kind of being seen as having their own families, as having adult responsibilities. And so a lot of burden of care is transferred to children because the adults are too busy. And for some reason that resonated a lot with me and with the kind of informal stories that one hears about the queer person in the family doing all of the elder care, or people who are not married or single being seen as having lots of time on their hands. And so they can do the school runs, they can go to the hospital, they can fill in the cracks. So I think just as you are decentering depletion with respect to geography, I think we could also decenter this idea of the normative with respect to the kind of generational intervention that you're making. That, you know, maybe the problem, so to speak, with the literature on social reproduction is not that it reifies heteronormativity, but that it sort of assumes that people who are not reproducing heteronormativity through marriage and that kind of normative intergenerationality are actually doing more care work and not less. So I think that's something that, you know, certainly that was the kind of the aha moment that I had as I was reading a book, and I think there will be many more. I'll just quickly say that there were also some delightful moments for people who have been following South Asian feminist critique for a long time, citing organizations like Jagori and the older work that that NGO did, the research work that NGO did on housework and women's work early on. being able to incorporate some of the older social reproduction literature, some of the radical feminist critiques from the 1980s, which are still, can you believe it, so relevant to us today. I think as a teacher, that's a very important thing for us to convey to our students. It was also wonderful to see so much emphasis on travel and on the kind of interstitial so-called dead time between productive moments. So, jumping over the fence, being on the train, not wanting to fall asleep on the train, wanting to be able to do it all, wanting to not be depleted and being more depleted in the process. It reminded me of books like Metronoma by Rashmi Sadhana. And in some way, I think even though this book is trying to decenter certain geographies, it actually gives us a very rich sense of these places, of Coventry, of Delhi, of the Eastern Cape. And that's not an easy thing to pull off. I'll end by just a couple of smaller points. One, I think it's really fascinating that we are still talking about and with people who are themselves not categorizing housework as real work. And I think in feminist activism, that has always been a problem of, girls, in rural parts of India, girls bringing water for the household from wells, that not being seen as work, that just being seen as chores that people do and not being seen as life-sustaining work. I was both surprised and unsurprised to see statements like that amongst your interlocutors in this book. I also, I won't say too much more because both the previous speakers have talked about FEOT, the methodological intervention, but I'll just say we still need these methodological interventions because the methods we use are not neutral. So the fact that a methodological intervention came out of this project is both gratifying and also, it creates lots of emotions in me because we are kind of saddled with these so-called objective methods that are anything but. I'll end by maybe asking a question, which is also, I think, there in Ruth's comments. I do wonder what people will make, or what, Shirin, what you would make of the relationship between redistributing social care or social reproduction work, as you call it, and redistributing capital. And I wonder if there is a conversation that you're having with people like Thomas Piketty or others, because I think the way you use redistribution within the private sphere is very important and pertinent and interesting. And then, your invocation of things like the debt crisis makes me think there's the bigger question that probably we do need a revolution for. So that's it. Thank you. Free Palestine.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Swati. Those were really wonderful comments, and so much to work with. I'm going to look around the virtual room to see if there are any hands. I'm sure there are many who would like to post questions. Okay, here we go. So Bina, so if it's okay, Shirin, we'll collect a couple of questions, and hopefully you can also respond to the readers if you wish while responding to those who have raised questions. Okay, so Bina, go ahead, please. And then Eleanor. Bina?
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much. Shirin, that was wonderful. I've also seen these very early chapters, and what you read was so beautifully written. I really want to read the book immediately. But my questions were the three kinds of questions, one of which I think we've had a bit of discussion over, which is taking, say, the narrower aspect of care rather than the broader aspect of social reproduction, which is childcare and elder care. And if you look at this historically and what's happening now, is that you have huge declines in fertility rates. I mean, in India, it's replacement level fertility, except in small parts of India. And so one would think that childcare responsibilities go down hugely. Now, people argue, well, elder care increases. But then when I looked at families living jointly, the figures are really low. 7% in the UK are multi-generational families, 16% in India, 18% in the USA. So that means that our standard imagination of the family where elders get old and then you look after them is changing, especially in middle class homes. You have children living all over the place, and they come back maybe if somebody's ill or provide financial support. But the actual amount of care time that's given is going down. So the first question is, how would you factor that in? And also then there's a gender division, because in elder care, at least in India, you find that men look after elderly males and women look after elderly females. So it's not entirely that women look after all the elders in the home. Of course, women, mothers-in-law may live longer because women live longer, but that's a different point. The second is that, I don't know your 8 case studies, but often when we're talking about care and the kind of description about women commuting, going back to work, coming and working for in other people's homes, cooking and so on. But in a way, that's the standard life of a working woman. So if you take women at call centers, you take women in factories, that's what they're doing. I mean, they are going, they're commuting, they're working, they're coming back and doing domestic work, cooking and everything else. So how would this be different if we are looking at women who are doing paid care work? Like, you look around Delhi and everybody has part-time maids. But the kind of description that one might have of women working, commuting, coming back and looking after the family is the standard life of many working women, not just of women doing paid care work. And the third was just a thought, that children also learn. So in a way, the development sector has been most vocal in childcare when children are working in factories. That's where it's been talked about more, rather than children helping out parents. And of course, the invisible part of that, which is horrendous, is what Swati pointed out, which is that children are also fetching firewood and fodder and water. But children also learn the gender roles by doing that work. So so people say, well, if you've got a son, he should also be learning how to cook, and daughters should be not always running around doing all the work that we think about. So how would you say, if children were not doing any support, any kind of care work in the home, call it care work, how would they learn these alternative roles, which could be transformative when they become parents themselves, or, get married and so on. So thank you.
Thank you, Beena. I'll collect 2 more questions from Eleanor and Shimenti. So Eleanor, go ahead. Yeah.
Hi, Shirin. Unfortunately, I haven't read your book, but I must say I'm really looking forward to it. Just want to make a few comments. One is, I think it's so wonderful to have more of a focus on the everyday, and both the material and the emotional aspects of social reproduction and its depletion, because, as I think Ruth had said, we're going through a cycle at the moment in the past few years where we've had a reinterest in social reproduction, but at a very macro level from a number of Marxist feminists. And I think they're really missing out a lot of the more everyday aspects of it, which I think is that meso level almost, which is completely missing when you see what is being written. So I think this is wonderful, sort of bringing these 2 aspects together, which I think is very much needed, particularly if we are going to try to develop strategies in overcoming or reducing that depletion. I think it's absolutely necessary, rather than at a very macro level of saying simply social reproduction is a subsidy to capital. I don't think that's going to get very far, in a sense. In that, I just wanted to pick up 1 or 2 points from someone who's working on migration and social reproduction. I mean, the commuting rang a bell because I thought, here we've got travel, but on a daily basis. But the whole point about the social reproduction using migrant labor is that travel is kind of condensed into a very short period. So we have kind of travel there, but it's distinctive to the commuting. And I think we're underplaying the amount that is happening in the South, because I'm also working on looking at the way that we represent the South as being so terribly different to the North. And I've been working on countries where there's an immense use of social reproductive labor by migrants and not by local workers. And I think this is an interesting, because it sounds to me like in the Delhi case, the examples you've given are largely of locals, whilst there is the huge use of reproductive labor by migrants. And the other thing, of course, is again, which the northern scholars tend to dismiss, internal migration, or even daily migration, you could call it, the commuting in the urban areas. And I think that's something which is, again, completely missing from a lot of the writing by northern scholars on, global chains of care and so on. So I think there's some really interesting connections I would make between your foci and that migration literature, which is another form of, it's another mitigation strategy, particularly in the absence of any state intervention, in providing more affordable, services. So I think it would be worth connecting up, and I'd love to discuss it with you more.
Great, thank you. And Shimanti?
Shirin, thank you very much. Lovely book. I actually wanted to ask a little bit of a different question, which is, so based on my work, my work is with sex workers in Shonagachi. And one of the interesting things of care work they do, apart from caring for customers, which they actively have to do, and is expected of them to do, that's part of what you would want to call a package, right? But what struck me, so my colleague Sirisha Naidu and I are completing a paper, is that focuses on care work in a little different way, which is due for the HIV/AIDS prevention programming. And in that, and I have attended several sessions, almost every year I have attended a session of run by either the National AIDS Control Organization or the State AIDS Control Organization, where they are training new peer educators, and also it's also a refresher course for existing peer educators. But the main thrust of the course, this whole education, the training, is that the women are kind of trained and told to make sure that the customer has to use the condom to protect himself, of course, and also to protect his family, right? That there is, but it's never about the protection of the sex worker herself, right? So the public health narrative, which the sex workers are recruited, goes in a direction that the care work from the part of the sex workers is for the man and his family, and by extension, kind of the health of the nation, right? And this kind of care work obviously is unpaid. They get paid to attend the training session, but the actual care work that goes in the moment where they have to actually convince, and this is not even conveyed to them euphemistically or indirectly. It isn't. It is a very direct way where the program officers actually say, this is your responsibility, that you have to implement and ensure that this happens, because it's not just your customer, but it's also his family. And if that happens, if there are lateral transmissions of the infection, then we are in trouble. Then HIV infections are going to research, all of that. Now, one of the things, and part of this is like the sex workers are bothered by this because, it's a very difficult work to be able to do that. But at the same time, and this is where I think my question is also, in some ways, they kind of have also imbibed this as their responsibility, like protecting the men within a very patriarchal framework. And so when I would ask them, like, this seems like you don't get paid for this. It's like, the peer educators are supposed to be working just with the sex workers, but here you have to also work with the customers and an enormous level of care work. But they kind of also, not that they love this, they don't, but they, at the same time, they are also kind of, they say that, well, that's what wives would do anyway. So they kind of see themselves in that very heteronormative role of care work and do not quite see the problem of like this care work as uncompensated. So I think it's a little more complex when we are thinking about the larger patriarchal, the heteronormative frame, that those who we are saying are doing this unpaid work do not necessarily see that unpaid work, and they elevate care work as part of what they should be doing. And I'm not saying that this is the best. It's not. I mean, they understand, they resist to a certain extent, but they are also happy. Not happy might be a strong word, but they are also keen to do that. They kind of see. So it's, what I'm saying is this care work is also embedded in a larger patriarchal framework. And if we are talking about women, I think there is a level of complexity here that they feel like, yes, I'm not getting paid, but it's also my duty to do this because I am a woman. I have to do this. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Srimati. So, Shirin, lots of questions for you. You can pick and choose what you'd like to respond to, but we can also go over a little bit in case more people have questions, which I'm sure they do. So over to you.
Well, firstly, thank you so much for all the comments, but in particular to Swati, to Ruth, to Deepta, despite her eye problems, for reading the book so closely and giving me such fantastic comments. So thank you, and thank you to all of you for turning up to hear about the book. I wanted to maybe bunch one is sort of methodological question that has come up over and over again. So which is great for me because we're still sort of developing this methodology, and I don't want to call it anything like an anthropological approach. I mean, we've got Swati here, so she'll tell us immediately that it isn't. Because really, what I wanted was a snapshot, to try and see what kind of rhythms, what kind of pressures, what kind of resources of social reproduction become available to or not a woman going about her everyday life. And that snapshot obviously is nothing like a deeply embedded and anthropological study of, going to a community, staying there, working overtime. We didn't even have the possibility of doing it like repeatedly. So that's one thing to think about. Can you do a fiat in a community or in a household or in with an individual repeatedly, like maybe like time use survey is done, right? So very much inspired by that, but we didn't have the resources, but also it's quite intrusive actually as a methodology. And I'm increasingly getting worried about our complicity as researchers, or I should say my complicity as a researcher in intruding into people's lives to collect data, which I think will make a difference, but it most often doesn't, right? And that, of course, relates to the bigger question of our level of analyses and who are we trying to convince to make change happen, to make transformative change happen. So I think there are some really, and then finally, and Janti Lingam is here, who did this work in Sri Lanka, and she will tell you that actually it's not just intrusive to families, but it's very tiring for the researchers. Pooja Ghosh in Delhi, she would arrive at the household at 6 o'clock in the morning and not leave till they went to bed. It was very tiring for us. And I've still got, and I cite some of her emails to me saying, oh God, I didn't realize how tiring it would be. So I think issues about the ethics of research, of how we do research, and the claims we make for the research are really an ongoing issue for me. But I think in terms of the methodology, the plus side of it, and Ruth, you used that term, which I really think is at the heart of it, which is the textured nature of it, you know? So it was, for me, what it revealed, whether it was Jayanti doing her work in Sri Lanka, or Mel Johnson doing it in Myanmar, or Pooja doing it in Delhi, was that this methodology revealed the textured nature of everyday rhythms of, or rhythms of everyday life, including the pace, including in terms of the way in which people feel tired, the length of commutes and how they respond to it, whether they are able to kind of do other socially productive work as they are commuting by calling up family members who might not be very well, or etc. So it's exactly that texturedness which I thought came out in through this methodology that I haven't found in the data that I have seen and read through in terms of time use. So I'm not making a claim here in terms of, the end study, obviously. But for me, by its very nature, it has to be a small study, right? But it builds on data that is available to us in terms of where is this individual located, in what kind of socioeconomic conditions is this person or the household or the community located, and etc. And also in that context, I mean, again, you've already said that, Ruth, but Prabha's work on sort of how does legal judgments and legal sort of strategies allow us to see certain aspects of social reproduction, which are very often not seen, right, by social scientists. That, I mean, and Prabha, also Pratiksha Bakshi's work, she has actually done what you were wanting to do, which is to see how do you actually reflect on the process, the legal process in the courts, and how does that work help us think through social reproductive work of, and violence that social reproductive work might attract. So I think they were really, really thoughtful comments. And I would say that I think, Swati, your comment about children, I will really have to think that through. And I need to educate myself better anyways in terms of the queer lens on this issue, because you're quite right. I think, at least in my research, I feel like that is missing as a jigsaw piece. It is, but the fact that you could see that gives me hope that I can kind of use this lens and learn with you and from you on that. So thank you so much for that. So the other big question that you posed was about the connection, and Eleanor's question about the meso is, I've always been driven by, whether it is my work on performance and politics, or it is my work on depletion, I've always, and social reproduction, I've always been interested in the how question, right? And so it was Diane Elson's kind of comment in this, the 2000 report that she led on, the UN report on the status of women's work, what was it? I can't remember the exact title now, but it was the UN Women's Report in 2000. That made me think, yes, absolutely depletion, but how? What does this mean? And etc. So on that, of course, what I wanted to say was that transformation, as we wrote also in our original paper with, I wrote with Catherine and Dania Thomas, and I have to say the framing of depletion as both individuals, households, communities, and mitigation, replenishment, and transformation was there at the heart of that paper, not just my book. So that was a kind of but if I connect those two, it is so important, I think, to treat transformation as a bundle of strategies, not as revolution, you know, because that seems like when I think of what's happening in Gaza just now, what's happening in Europe with the rise of the right, I mean, it feels a very, when our moments of hope come from Modi winning a third term, but actually with a low majority, if that's a moment of hope, then a revolution which will redistribute not only social reproductive work, but capital, to go back to Swati's, it seems a very, very far away place. Does that mean that we should stop thinking about it and reimagining this world? Absolutely not. But I think what Catherine and Dania and I were trying to say was that through these mitigatory and replenishing strategies, you can start building, as you said, Ruth, about sort of, refusing. A refusal can be absolutely a transformative moment individually. But does that connect with the bigger transformative moments? Sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. And so the strategies that we talked about, and I saw when I was looking at examining all these cases in the book, were meso level strategies. They were pushing for change, and sometimes micro level strategies in the chapters 2 and 3, where these women were sort of coping with their everyday lives. So on that, I think I want to go to very briefly to Bina's point about commuting, that everybody does this. Well, everybody, I think the point of the chapter, and I really will, you'll get a copy, don't worry, is that people commute differently. So some people walk, and that texturedness of what is the terrain Mira walks through, right? Some people go by public transport, and we know the problems that come with sometimes traveling at the wrong time. And some people travel by car, and there is even there a distinction, which is sort of some people drive in Delhi's mad traffic, and others who are driven by chauffeurs. So travel is not simply just kind of, everybody travels, but everybody travels differently. And that has a different depleting effect on people. So in terms of childcare and elder care and declining fertility and rising, I think we can talk about this at length, actually. But the case that I profile in among those 8 is this young woman who's got a baby. It's only one child, it's not many children, but how her whole rhythm changes entirely. It is not simply about numbers, but it is about responsibility. It is about lack of resources to draw upon. It is about isolation very often, which is what came through to me in this case. Eleanor, absolutely agree. And so with migration, and I need to engage with that. In fact, I'm trying to do it now with my colleague and Sabha Joshi and Vanita Elias. We are putting together a project on circular migration in India, inspired by the COVID crisis. I was sort of, talking about, where all these people who were rural migrants into the city were just basically thrown out of jobs and told to go back home without any support of the state. And that led to so much pain for these people. So you're absolutely right. And finally, Simanthi, yes and yes. just with sex workers, but actually, I think Oxfam did a wonderful report in 2019 where they said domestic work is also a trigger for violence, right? And so I would suspect is this, if we think about Bhavri Devi's case so long ago now, which was that, this volunteer going and stopping child marriage, well, what could be better than that? But actually, attracting absolute terrible violence upon her own body as a result of that, without any state support, by the way, and without, on the contrary. So I think that these are really important matters and sort of, need to be thought through this lens of depletion is what I'm trying to do. And obviously I can't do everything, but I hope that it allows us to think through different aspects of life, and take this seriously as an issue for all of us who are working on care and social reproduction.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Shirin. That was very, very well done, responding to everyone in good time. So I just want to check, we're just at time, but if anyone has any questions or comments or thoughts for Shirin, we can stay for a few minutes. So I believe, Shirin, you'll have a discount flyer for the book in due course, right? That
Yes, I
okay.
will. this is Oxford doing system change just as the book is coming out. So I have yes, and so if people would like that, it's actually in paperback, so it's not very expensive, but it does give you 30% off. So please let me know if you'd like one, and I'll send it when I get it. So thanks, Prabha, for remembering to say that.
I've shared Shirin's email. So if we don't have any other comments, I think we just want to thank you, Shirin, for an absolutely wonderful book. It's really lucidly written, yet completely brilliant. So I think it's something that we can share with our students quite well, as well as learn from ourselves. So I think it's wonderful. So congratulations, and thanks to all of you for joining us on a Friday. And do stay tuned for other events. And if anyone couldn't attend today's talk, we have recorded it, and we will be posting it on our website. So here it is. Great. So thank you, Shirin. Thank you. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you in particular to you, Prabha. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.